a warm welcome to this webinar, where we will learn more about how we can develop our own impact CV and why that is so important. So my name is Elisabeth Rajala, and I'm a researcher at SLU and also coordinating the Global Challenges University Alliance, which is a global network of 20 universities across the globe with a common vision of contributing to sustainable global development. And we arrange different kind of activities. And today I'm very happy to have Professor Catherine Andrews with us. And Catherine is the director of Griffith Institute for Drug Discovery, located in Brisbane, Australia. I know you're in Darwin today, but we are so happy to have you here. So thank you very much for accepting to share your experiences of developing an impact CV. Before I leave the word to you, Catherine, I wanted to inform that this webinar is being recorded so we can share with colleagues from countries which it's in the middle of the night right now. And Catherine will start with presenting, and then there will be room for questions. And as this is a webinar, you will not be able to unmute and ask the questions directly, so you will need to use the Q&A function just next to the chat function. So questions, please post them using the question and answer function. I think that was all. So please, Catherine, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the invitation to present. I'm very happy to be here and to say hello to everybody wherever you are. I will try sharing my screen and just maybe let me know if that's okay. How is that looking?
Perfect. Now, perfect.
Fantastic. So really pleased to be here today to tell you a little bit more about why I developed an impact CV. This is one of the buildings of my institute you can see here in Brisbane, and we're surrounded by a forest. So sometimes we see koalas in the trees, but more often we see snakes on the road. So it's a lot of nature around us. In Australia, it's very common to pay respect to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting, and to pay our respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I wanted to do that today too. And I would also like to pay my respects to all Indigenous persons wherever we're meeting in the different countries, and to pay that respect. So as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm actually in Darwin today. So this is where I'm normally located, in Brisbane, and it's about 2,800 kilometres up the top here to Darwin. Temperature difference of this morning when I left, it was about 19 degrees, and now up in Darwin, it's about 33 degrees. So very big jump in temperature, but we have some long distances to cover in Australia. So today I really wanted to tell you a little bit about my career background on one slide, just because it's nice to know who you're listening to, but then mainly focus on a little bit about impact definitions, then why I wrote an impact CV, what exactly is an impact CV, but most of the time will be spent talking to you about some case study examples, because I think practical examples are really the best way to show you how I actually use an impact CV and why I use an impact CV. So let's get started. So I am a malaria drug discovery researcher. I have a PhD, however, in microbial biotechnology. So I was characterizing restriction enzymes from bacteria that live at very high temperatures down here in 1998. While I was writing up my PhD, I started working at the Red Cross Blood Service in Brisbane, looking at genotyping different blood groups. And at that point, I met someone who worked on malaria, and that really hooked me. And ever since then, I've been working on malaria. So I carried out a postdoc on malaria in a biomedical research institute in Australia, and then very quickly thereafter moved to Germany. So I was very, very lucky to win an Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, and I worked in Heidelberg for 4 years in total, 2 as a von Humboldt Fellow, and another 2 years because I just loved it so much. My husband and I wanted to stay a bit longer. The focus of my research was on pregnancy-associated malaria, looking at knocking out the gene that was associated with this particular type of malaria at the time, and also on cytoadhesion inhibitors. I moved back to Australia in 2003 and really wanted to do that so that I could have a family. I was a group leader there in Australia, and my daughter was born in 2006. Her name is Emma, and she's 16 years old now. Just to go back to this timeline here, I did include a little bubble up the top here about a visit that I had to sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the reasons that I've done that is because that was a really important milestone in my career. Seeing malaria, people suffering from malaria in an endemic country really was an eye-opener and really showed me what the impact of the disease was, and highlighted to me that the impact of my research or my students' research or my colleagues' research really could make a difference. And so that was a real turning point for me. Obviously, having a daughter is a turning point as well. If anyone has children, you know this. I actually joined the university that I'm at now in about 2009 on a fellowship, and then was promoted, and in 2018 became the deputy director of this institute. In 2019, the director, and I'm also the director of a national facility of compound curation and management. There are a couple of other little things in here and some awards that I've won, and I've highlighted those because one of the ways that you can use an impact CV is to help you for a lot of different things, and writing award applications is one of those. I've also mentioned up the top here about a STEM engagement project that I founded in 2007 called That's Rad Science, and I'm going to come back to that one a little bit later on. So I hope that's given you on one slide a little bit of an idea about my research focus is really from very, very early on working on malaria, which is a disease that still kills 1,000 children every day, so very significant. So when we talk about impact, you'll all be in different countries and you'll all have different funders and different organisations, government organisations that have their own definitions of impact. So these are some of the impact definitions from Australia. And you can see that they're all a little bit different, but there are some common things running through them. So our National Biomedical Research Funding Organisation defines impact as verifiable outcomes, but not the prospective or anticipated effects of research. So some evidence is needed. The government that funds our basic research says it's a contribution to academia beyond, contribution beyond academic research. Another definition is, again, from our university, is around demonstrable contribution. So we really need to have some kind of evidence to say that what we're doing in research, in engagement, in teaching, in building infrastructure is actually having some kind of impact. And this is quite challenging sometimes. So this was not something that was part of my career. I, as you saw, had a very typical academic career, PhD, postdoc, group leader, professor, and now head of an institute. So very typical academic career. And when I was coming through as a junior postdoc, we weren't really thinking too much about how to track impact and how to plan for impact. I just wanted to do really cool science and ultimately help people suffering from malaria, but I wasn't really thinking about this in great detail. So I think there has been a cultural shift in the past 5 years that I've seen in Australia, and I know this is happening in other parts of the world. In Sweden, also talking to Elizabeth, she said there's some movements in the donor community as well to make sure that we're communicating our impact in a much better way. There are a number of challenges to impact, including sometimes there's a lag between getting to that point of impact and being able to communicate it. Sometimes the assessment criteria that we're given may be set after we've actually done the research, so we haven't planned for impact and we haven't recorded any evidence of what we've been doing. Very important to acknowledge that impact doesn't necessarily happen for every piece of research. So fundamental basic science sometimes doesn't have an immediate clarity around impact. It may be a decade or a few decades before somebody uses that basic knowledge to do something that is truly impactful. And as we've seen on the previous slide, there are so many different definitions of impact. And I'm sure in each of your countries, you can go and find, again, some different definitions of impact. And our perceptions of what impact means can differ depending on whether you're talking to community members, to research funders, to donors, to government, to policymakers. In some organisations, there is a bit of a misconception that impact is just something that you think about at the end of your research and not something that you really plan for at different stages of your research. And that's really where I think the impact CV is potentially quite helpful. Some people may not think there's a sense of urgency around thinking about impact. And it can be difficult in some cases to gain evidence of impact. So we have to acknowledge there are lots of challenges, but it is actually important to start thinking about what we can do within these constraints. So I just want to acknowledge that demonstrating impact can actually be really, really hard. So you heard a little bit about my career. I work on malaria. Malaria is a disease that kills 1,000 children every day. It is causing huge health, economic and social burdens. So in reality, I'm working in an area that has very high potential for huge impactful outcomes. If I were to discover a new blockbuster drug that could be used in the endemic community that could save lives, this would be a really impactful outcome. So my work has that potential to have huge outcomes in health. Having said that, if you're working in the area of drug discovery, you will know that very, very few molecules actually make it into a drug. So it's quite likely that everything that I work on will actually fail in my career. It may be my student or my student's student who ultimately makes a breakthrough that really does have that impact. So demonstrating impact can be hard. I'm an experienced researcher. I've been researching, well, I finished my PhD in 98. I'll let you do the maths on that. It's hard for me. And so then I acknowledge that it can be really hard for some of our more junior researchers as well. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share this idea of an impact CV with people. So I, a few years ago, started using an impact CV, and I didn't think I could find anything like it around. So I contacted the editors of Nature Careers and said, what about this? Would people be interested? And they said, yeah, let's write an article. Thank you to the Nature Careers editors. They were so great in helping to write this article. We also developed a free downloadable CV template. It's in a Word document so that you can modify it and do what you like to it. It's free to access. Just click on the article. You can look at the QR code there if you like, and it takes you to a page. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and there's a link where you can download the CV, and truly you can do what you like with it. You can modify it, you can add things to it, you can delete things. So this is really what inspired me to write an impact CV and to work with an impact CV is this recognition that impact planning, tracking and communication is incredibly important, but perhaps we're not trained to think like that. So what can an impact CV be used for? Well, it can be used for so many different things. It can be used to track evidence, to develop stories and to help with planning for impact. But the things that you might like to think about using these impact stories for include promotion applications, awards and prizes, collaborations when you're approaching someone to give an idea of what kind of impact your research might have had in the past. If you're applying for a job, it could be something that you're asked on a selection panel. What is the impact or most impactful piece of research? So having some evidence around that is really important. If you're applying or being elected into a professional society, knowing that you've had impact across teaching, engagement, research is incredibly important. And we've already mentioned fundings and donors. Some that you might not think about is maybe revamping your LinkedIn profile or your institutional profile to really demonstrate that what you're doing isn't just a series of papers in Nature, that there is something beyond this. And I think there is potential there also to write more interesting social media stories and tweets and so on. And I'm going to come back to this final point here, the idea of an impact slide for very young researchers who are early in their careers who may not have an impact story to tell yet, and how you may be able to use an impact slide to start thinking about things when you're giving presentations. So the impact CV that I developed was in collaboration with the Australian Association of Medical Research Institutes, who had developed a research impact framework that had been published in the last 12 months. And the types of impact that are included here are the typical impact outputs that you see: social impacts, advancing knowledge, research capacity building, informing decision-making, health impacts, and economic impacts. And so what I did was I contacted AMRI and said, look, I really want to develop a free downloadable impact CV template. Can I use some of the things you've developed to make this a bit more professional? And we worked together with AMRI to generate this tool that you can all use as you like. So this is what it looks like. It is a set of Word document, and on the left-hand side, you'll see a number of indicators. There are different headings up here. The example I've given here is advancing knowledge, so that might be for people in basic science area. different indicators down the side, and just a space for you to track your evidence. And I'll show you a little bit more about this in some examples in a moment. But in terms of advancing knowledge, some of the things that you see in a traditional CV may also be useful in an impact CV, including the number of citations you have. But there may be other things that you don't normally keep track of. So it could be things like community awareness, it could be presentations to government and so on. So this is really just a way to track that evidence. And each of the sections then has an impact story or case study box where you can start to develop some impact stories. And you may like to think about different kinds of impact stories depending on your target audience. So if you're talking to donors and community members, your impact story would look very different to talking to a funder for a fellowship or a promotion panel. Another example here is research capacity building, which people often don't think about. But if you're making contributions that are really helping other researchers and people in the industry to achieve their goals, developing research infrastructure and capacity can be a really important and impactful thing to do. So this might be, for example, training clinicians and allied health professionals. Really interesting one is open access registries and open access databases. Many of us are contributing data to these open access databases. You know, who knows what people are going to use that for, what your research may then lead to when someone else takes that research and does something with it. So I think that's a really great one to include. So that's kind of roughly what the template looks like, but more importantly, I wanted to show you some examples of how I use this. So you might be asking, what is the difference then between a traditional CV and an impact CV? Well, first of all, I don't ever consider sending my impact CV to someone in a promotion or for an application. To me, this is a way of tracking information. It's a way of developing stories that I then use in different ways. So a traditional CV would be lots of metrics. It would be lists of appointments, grants, papers, your prizes and award, committees you've served on, the students you've supervised, and you would definitely use this for grant applications, for promotion cases and job applications and so on. An impact CV is a little bit different. There is some crossover. For example, citations of papers could be crossing over, but then things like social media research. Who actually used your research and why did they use it? How did they use it? And what was the outcome is something that we often don't think about as researchers. Testimonials, if you're working with industry partners or if you're working with community or philanthropic organisations. And collecting evidence may even include survey data to actually show that what you're doing is actually making a difference. And I'll come back to that one in a minute. And so to me, an impact CV is really for me, it's for individual researchers to track a database of evidence that they can use in bespoke ways, so in tailored ways, depending on what they want to do. I also think an impact CV is a really important way to prompt you to plan for impact. So one of the things that I do is I actually don't delete any of the sections on the impact CV that I have. Some of the sections over my career I will never be able to fill. There'll be no evidence, they're not areas that I'm working in. But the reason I leave those sections in is because it does remind me that there are many different kinds of impact, and it also challenges me to think outside the box a little bit, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So let's start with the first case study. Excuse me. So I'm going to use new knowledge, so research findings, sort of fundamental science, and give you an example of how that might actually lead to an impact, and you may not realise that. So these are two papers of mine that I published many, many years ago now. So the first was a seminal paper showing that certain HIV drugs, protease inhibitors, also kill malaria parasites in the lab. And the second paper, we showed that this also occurred in vivo in a mouse malaria model. So these papers have reasonable number of sites, which is definitely something that I could mention in a normal CV. But I guess when you're thinking about developing an impact story or a case study, we want to think a little bit beyond that. So while this might have been fundamental basic science research, what happened because of that? Who took this information and then did something else? And so here is an example of a potential case study story that I've written. So the first paragraph is really around the problem of malaria, the problem of drug resistance, and why we need to understand, develop new drugs, understand how our current drugs work, and so on. But if we just look at the second paragraph here, My seminal work showing that HIV protease inhibitor drugs have activity against malaria parasites opened up a new area of research, leading to clinical trials in Africa by others to test whether there would be reduced malaria rates in people taking these drugs. As a result, it was discovered that these HIV protease inhibitor drugs did not directly reduce malaria incidence, which is a negative finding, but still very important in HIV infected people, but in fact that it could decrease malaria incidence due to drug-drug effects, so an interaction between the protease inhibitor and the malaria drug. And so this was a really important piece of information that arose from my seminal work. Other people did it, but they took the knowledge that I generated and used that for something else. And this in turn has led to that kind of information about drug-drug interactions being included in WHO treatment guidelines, in prescribing sheets, and so on. So really looking at your papers and saying not just that you published a great paper and it got a certain number of sites, but did anyone actually use your work and do something really cool? Did they go on and solve a problem? Did they use it in an unexpected way? So in this case, other people, as a result of work that I started, this ultimately was taken up by other people who carried out clinical trials in Africa, and then this in turn led to an impact. So I think that is one way of showing how knowledge can actually lead to some kind of impactful change, and you will all have your own examples as well. So go and have a look at your papers and who's been citing them. That's my advice to you. The second case study that I wanted to show you uses the impact CV as an example. So it's a fairly new story, but that's okay. And really badging this under the research capacity building. So a way of developing, improving the skills of people through perhaps telling you about the impact CV and telling you about how I plan for impact and communicate impact. And so this is what it looks like. The impact CV, the way that I use it is for me. It's not for a funder. It's not for an external party. So I just dump information into it. I dump evidence into this. So you can see it's kind of dot point format evidence. So the first bit of evidence is around how many people actually visited the Impact CV website when it was first published. So within a month or so, there are around 6,000 unique page views, an average time of 3 minutes per view, which I understand is fairly reasonable. Some of you will know about altmetric scores as well, which give you an idea about how much sort of traffic is going to one of your papers. So within the first month or so, an altmetric score of 92. When you start to look at the data, you can get a little bit more information. So for example, the evidence of reach that I've listed here could be the number of people who tweeted about this CV in the first month. So there were 138 users with a combined 4 million followers. So perhaps this is a way that you could show that your work is getting out there. If you're publishing LinkedIn posts or articles, looking at who is viewing the post, where do they come from? You can see here that one of the posts that I wrote had more than 10,000 LinkedIn views from professors, from students, and from people all over the world. So, of course, social media metrics is not everything that you want to use, but it is one of the things that you can use for evidence depending on your project. Here's some more evidence. So I've given quite a lot of talks and a few more coming up in the future about the Impact CV. So I'm keeping track of how many people are attending those talks, because every time I give a talk like this, I hope that somebody is learning something new and they in turn might think about impact a little bit differently. So the reach could be about how many people I've reached through seminars and workshops. I don't use comments or testimonials very often, but it is something that some of you may be able to use in your research. So I've given an example here. So with the permission of the people who gave these quotes, some feedback from a former postdoc of mine said, I went to my list of publications and checked who was citing my publishings. That was amazing to see how many findings have been shared and enabled others' outcomes along the years. So she had never actually looked to see who was citing her papers and why. Down the bottom here, we have someone who's managing a core infrastructure facility in Australia. Said, I really enjoyed your article. It's got me thinking a lot though. My value is often compared in strict academic terms, and whilst it stacks up okay, the true worth of core leaders like myself is often lost. I think this is an avenue I really need to explore. So can you demonstrate with evidence that what you're doing might change the way someone is thinking and how they're communicating their own impact? So you could put this together in a story like this. Again, this is just an example for this presentation to show you how you might pull some of this evidence together. My work on the development and communication of an impact CV and free downloadable template has contributed to the research capacity building in impact planning and communication. And then I list the evidence that I've mentioned on the previous slide there, including the testimonials. So it is an example of how you might take a community engagement activity and really track how many times you're giving an outreach activity, who is attending, how many people are attending. Are they actually, is there a change being made? Is there some new way of thinking because of what you're doing? So I've given myself a little note there to say, what is the next step for this project? Well, I published the paper in February this year. Perhaps in a year's time, I might like to follow up on some of the people who've downloaded the impact CV and see whether or not there has been a change in the way they plan for impact. This would provide me with some really great evidence that what I'm doing here, making this available, free for anyone in the world, is it actually making a change? So this may actually encourage me to think about doing something in a year's time or so to see if this is the case. I want to give you another example, and that's from a project called That's Rad Science. So I've put this under impact practices, so looking at community engagement. So I am a sort of a traditional researcher in that I went from my undergraduate to PhD, postdoc, research group leader, and so on. And I often in Australia go and talk to high schools, and I talk to the students about how great it is to get a career in science, technology, engineering, maths, or medicine, that along the way you pick up lots and lots of different skills, communication skills, project planning skills, critical thinking skills. All sorts of skills are picked up when you're studying science, technology, engineering, maths, or medicine. And I would tell these high school students that this can lead you into so many different careers. There's so much that you can do with these skills. But I started to feel like a little bit of a fraud because actually I had had that traditional academic career. And so I actually challenged myself to think a little bit differently, to think a bit more like a social entrepreneur. So I started this STEM engagement project. To date, we've produced 4 children's picture books, one on parasites, one on nanotechnology, one on forensic science, and one on protein crystal science. And we've given out books around Australia and internationally free to the community. And this was to me to be able to say that I'm using those skills that I have in a slightly different way. So the engagement has been fantastic. So as I said, 4 books published, 7,000 copies distributed. So we estimate the reach there is about 20,000 people conservatively, and many, many engagement activities and events where we're talking about STEM outreach, which is a really great example of some evidence that I could cite. Having said that, I made quite a few assumptions. I assumed that my books would encourage children to think about STEM careers, and I assumed that by featuring women in STEM as role models, that would actually be an important thing to do. So my evidence to support these assumptions was pretty much zero. I had none. And so when I started using my impact CV, this prompted me to think about how I could actually gain some evidence. And so getting a little bit outside my comfort zone, this is not my core business. My background is in molecular biology and biotechnology. I developed a survey with an undergraduate student to survey adults who had children reading these books and to survey them on their perceptions. This all happened during the pandemic and lockdown too, so I'm very proud that we got this done. But really what it showed me now is that I had some evidence from the adults of these children saying that yes, they thought that the books do encourage the children to think about STEM careers. And yes, they do think that featuring women as role models is a good thing. So I think a really good example of me making some assumptions that my work was having impact, but not really having evidence to support that. And so through impact planning and tracking, you can start to change that paradigm. A couple of very quick case studies at the end. So some of the people listening to this may be very early in their career and may not have many papers. They may not have any papers yet and may be thinking, well, how is this going to help me? So we have a number of PhD students in our institute, and one of the things that we recently tried was engaging with them to think about including an impact slide in some of their student presentations. And so this really is questions around, do you know who will benefit from your research? Do you know who's involved in your research? Who will you work with? Have you talked about your research with the community, with industry partners, with philanthropic stakeholders, etc.? How often will you engage with these partners to talk about what they want, and how will this influence your planned research? What change will you make? Will this be an economic change? Will it be a health change? Will it be an environmental change? Will it be an education change? and how will you measure that? And then the impact type, so economic, social, health. And then what is the outcome? So what is the thing that you're going to do? And for my students, it's developing new drug leads for malaria, but in other fields, it could be in data mining programming, capacity building, and so on. So we encouraged our students to think about including an impact slide, and I have permission from 2 of them to show you what they did. So early days, we're still working on this, but this is my student, Yunan. She's almost submitting her PhD. She submits in about 4 weeks, so we've got a bit of work to do. She is, her top end user are people suffering from malaria. Her project stakeholders are one of our national organisations called CSIRO, her academic collaborators, and the Global Medicines for Malaria venture is her development pathway if she discovers something. The impact that she's targeting is health and welfare. And really, she's focused on this new knowledge to understand how a current malaria drug is used. And then, of course, the impact goal is to try and define the mode of action of this drug. So a really great example from Yunan, who also calls herself Ada. Another example from a researcher in my institute is from Saranya. So her impact goal is health and welfare too. And she wants to develop cost-effective biopolyester platforms for vaccine platform discovery, looking at T-cell mediated cytotoxicity. So her impact indicators are a little bit different. So she wants a change in cost or ease of access, as well as effectiveness of treatment for people living with these diseases. She has stakeholders that include industry partners and also cancer patients, which is great to see. So I think this is a great example of how someone early in their career can start to at least think about impact, what their pathway might be. The next step in this would be to say how you're actually going to generate evidence and track evidence. But I'm very proud of our students. They did a great job. And the final example that I wanted to show you is from a national resource that we hold at my institute called Nature Bank. And this is an impact communication workshop that we developed and ran very recently in our institute. So very pleased that our lockdown conditions are easing, so we didn't have to wear masks unless we'd just come out of isolation. This was carried out about a month or so ago, and what we really wanted to do was to challenge our research, our staff, our students, our professional officers to think about impact stories and to try and think about their research a bit differently. So we paired everybody up in teams and we went through a series of workshop activities where the ultimate aim was to develop a 3-minute pitch. So I'll give you one of those examples today based on Nature Bank. So in our institute, we hold Australia's largest natural product library. So it comprises 30,000 terrestrial and marine samples, and it's been prepared into drug and bioproduct screening libraries that make things a little bit more easy if you want to screen for pharmaceuticals, for nutraceuticals, cosmeceuticals, agrochemicals, etc. And so this was the case study. And so we had a senior researcher who runs this resource as the kind of person who was providing information. And then the workshop was carried out by the staff and students at his table. This is kind of what it looked like. So I literally did a screenshot of one of the sheets. So who are the project stakeholders? So this team thought that it was the local community, potentially Indigenous communities or not-for-profit organisations. Pharma might be interested and academics might be interested. The project types or types of impact could be health and welfare or economic. And then there were some also interesting thoughts around society, looking at culture and creativity. And so some indicators here around industry and academic collaboration and investment in R&D. So it was a very quick exercise. We did it all in an hour and a half, but this is the kind of impact story that you might get from this. So some information there about natural products having such a big impact in health and across aquaculture, agriculture, and many other areas. And in case you didn't know, natural products have inspired some of the most effective agrochemicals, and around 50% of all antibiotics and medicines are from nature or derived from nature, which is, I think, quite interesting. Australia is one of only 17 megadiverse countries and is renowned for its unique biota. So the pitch would be that I'm from Nature Bank, Australia's largest natural product library, and these unique biota that we have been prepared into 125,000 extract and screening fraction libraries that can be tested for any disease application or other application. We get to the impacts here. Curation and use of Nature Bank has led to numerous impacts, including the identification of 2,000 new species, the identification of 4,000 natural product compounds, hundreds of community engagement activities, training of dozens of research students, and the discovery of numerous therapeutic drug leads for cancer, infectious diseases, and other diseases. And then if you were pitching this to potential funders or donors, you would have the ask at the end about, come and work with us, come and support us. So I think this is a really great example of how we can start to think a little bit differently about how we communicate the impact of our research. So, for example, the impact beyond the primary goal here. So, while this was not the goal of our institute, we wanted to look at these natural products for drug discovery. In the process of collecting these 30,000 biota, our museum and herbarium discovered 2,000 new species, which is just amazing. Our natural product chemists have discovered more than 4,000 natural products. So this is new knowledge. And while we may not be using it directly ourselves, in the future, someone may take some of these molecules and solve one of the world's biggest problems. So that future potential is there. And then, of course, community engagement. So education beyond academia. Who are we telling about our research and how important it is? So a few examples there of how that evidence might come to build a pitch to funders or donors. Of course, you could adapt this wording if you were talking to a prize or award committee, or if you were telling someone about this if you were in a job interview, for example. So I hope that that has given you a bit of an overview about why I wrote an impact CV. I'm putting this slide up here because I really think the biggest thing for me is the impact CV challenges me to think differently. It challenges me to think about what kind of evidence can I provide? How can I incorporate that into my research project planning? What do communities want? What do they want to know about? What do industry partners want? How can I collect evidence that shows the impact of the things that I'm doing across research, across engagement, across teaching, across other areas that you might be working in? And as I mentioned previously, I do leave all the sections in my impact CV, even if I can't track any evidence, because to me, that reminds me to think outside the box. It reminds me to think a little bit differently and to perhaps change some of the things that I'm doing. For example, surveying to get evidence might be a little bit unusual for me, and that's a good thing, I think. So thank you very much. Thanks to the AMRI for working with me on the impact CV, to the Nature Careers editor, Jeffrey Perkle, who was fantastic, and to everybody who contributed slides for me to use today. I thank you also for the invitation, and I hope that that has been useful to some of the people who are listening.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This was really interesting and inspiring. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and start to fill out your impact CVs. Thank you. Bye-bye.